This is Land of Havilah, Romans 11. Paul's just been saying his desire and prayer is for Israel to be saved, and he went through some Old Testament prophecies which predicted the Gentiles would be receptive, but the Jews resistant. Now going on, verse 1. I ask then, did God reject his people? May it never be. For I also am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. God didn't reject his people, which he foreknew. Or don't you know what the Scripture says about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have broken down your altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But how does God answer him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even so then, at this present time also, there's a remnant according to the election of grace. Comment in verse 1, Paul asks the rhetorical question, did God reject his people Israel? And he says, may it never be, I'm an Israelite. And in verses 2 and 3, no, God didn't reject his people. However, the situation is something like it was in Elijah's time. Elijah thought he was the only faithful Israelite left, but God said, no, I reserved 7,000 men for myself. The point here is that out of hundreds of thousands of Israelites, 2 Samuel 24:9, only a small fraction was faithful to Yahweh. It was so in Elijah's time, therefore it's not surprising it's still the same in Paul's time, that Israel is mostly hard toward God. Only a remnant was faithful in Elijah's time, and only a remnant is faithful in Paul's time. It's old news and nothing surprising. In verse 5, in Paul's time, there was a, quote, remnant according to the election of grace, end quote. In other words, not all Jews were saved, just some of them, a small number of them. Their salvation was according to God's election of them, which means he chose them. But at the same time, we should remember that salvation is open to everyone, Joel 2:32, John 3:16, Mark 8:34, Luke 9:24, Luke 14:11, John 6:35, Romans 10:11, Acts 2:21, and on and on. So how can the two ideas be compatible of election and of it being our choice? Let's just take the attitude, quote, this knowledge is beyond me. It's lofty. I cannot attain to it, Psalm 139:6. Since salvation is by grace and election, verse 6, and if by grace, then it's no longer of works, otherwise grace is no longer grace. But if it's of works, it's no longer grace, otherwise work is no longer work. Comment in verse 6, since salvation is by grace, it's not by works. If it were by works, it couldn't at the same time be by grace. It has to be one or the other. Grace it is. Verse 7. What then? That which Israel seeks for, that he didn't obtain, but the chosen ones obtained it, and the rest were hardened. According as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, to this very day. David says, let their table be made a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened, that they may not see, always keep their backs bent. Comment verse 7 is very clear in saying, with regard to salvation, quote, the chosen ones obtained it and the rest were hardened, end quote. So again, salvation is a matter of God's choice, and hardening is a matter of his choice. And again in verse 8, hardening comes from God, quote, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, to this very day, end quote. Paul cites it from Isaiah 29, verse 10. And to bring up a question of our own, how is it just and right on the part of God that he elects some for salvation and hardens others? We don't know. It's beyond us and too lofty for us. We simply trust the judge of all the earth to do what's right, Genesis 18:25. Now, still on the topic of Israel's hardening, verse 11, I ask then, did they stumble that they might fall? May it never be. But by their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if their fall is the riches of the world, and their loss the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you who are Gentiles. Since then, as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, I glorify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh, and may save some of them. For if the rejection of them is the reconciling of the world, what would their acceptance be but life from the dead? Comment in your narrator's understanding of verses 11 to 15 is something to the effect, I ask then, did Israel stumble and fall in such a way that they'll never rise again? May it never be. God's still reaching out to Israel. He's using the salvation of the Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. Israel's stumbling has benefited the Gentiles, for as you know, when the Jews rejected the gospel, I, Paul, turned to the Gentiles, Acts 13:46 and 47. This was according to Isaiah's prophecy that God would make the Messiah a light not just to Israel, but to the nations, Isaiah 49:6. But if somehow the Israelites would come around to the gospel, it would benefit the Gentiles even more. I'm speaking to you Gentiles at the moment. I'm an apostle to you, but I would consider it a glorious thing if Israel might be saved through you. That is, if they would take note of how God has established a relationship with you and be jealous of that relationship. This desire is all the stronger in me because I'm an Israelite myself in terms of flesh and blood. For if Israel's rejection of the gospel meant the gospel went to the Gentiles more, think what would happen if Israel accepted the gospel. It would result in an even greater response among the Gentiles. It would bring life from the dead. So it's not like the Gentiles' win is Israel's loss. It's rather the more that are saved in either group, the more will be saved in both groups. The Jews because the Gentiles' relationship with God makes them jealous, and the Gentiles because the Jews' affirmation of the Messiah would be a further witness to them. Verse 16. If the first fruit is holy, so is the lump. Comment, that's also translated, if the first portion of the dough offered to God is holy, then the whole batch is holy. End quote, NET Bible. The first portion of the dough offered to God represents Israel. The rest of the dough, the bulk of it, represents Gentile believers. The point is that believing Jews and Gentiles are in essence the same. Both are holy to God. And there's another point in the dough metaphor that the Jews came first. They forged the way in the faith. Thanks to the Jews, believing Gentiles are joining themselves to something that's already well established. The Gentiles are much further along than they would have been without the Jews. Now, coming up in a metaphor that runs the length of 9 verses, God is a gardener who tends to a tree. Still in verse 16. If the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the root and of the richness of the olive tree, don't boast over the branches, but if you boast, it's not you who support the root, but the root supports you. You'll say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. True, by their unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by your faith. Don't be conceited, but fear. For if God didn't spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. See then the goodness and severity of God. Toward those who fell, severity, but toward you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise you also will be cut off. They also, if they don't continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God's able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of that which is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more will these, who are the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Comment, in verses 16 to 24, there's an extended metaphor about a holy tree. The tree represents God's work among mankind. In verse 20, God might cut a Jew or Gentile off the tree because of unbelief, or graft them onto the tree because of faith. Faith they're in, unbelief they're out. If he grafts in an Israelite, it's a natural fit, like grafting an olive branch into an olive tree. If he grafts a Gentile in, it's not a natural fit. It's like grafting in a wild olive branch. A Gentile couldn't be attached to the tree at all unless God had done an unusual thing. Nevertheless, when a Gentile is grafted in, he enjoys all the rich sustenance that the tree provides. Gentiles should keep in mind that though they've been grafted in, God could easily cut them off again, and they should keep in mind that though God has cut off some Jews, he could easily graft them back in very easily because they're a natural fit. Therefore, Gentiles attached to the tree should fear God and not exalt themselves over Jews who have been cut off. They should recognize this tree is essentially a Jewish tree. They should recognize that God didn't start with them, but with the Jews. They should be like Paul, desiring and praying that Israel would be saved. In verse 22, we should take note of the goodness and severity of God, also translated kindness and severity. God's kind to graft in someone because of faith and severe to cut them off for unbelief. Therefore, quote, continue in his goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off, end quote. Those are all the points God made with this metaphor, and we shouldn't extend the metaphor to make any other conclusions. If there were any other conclusions to make from this metaphor, Paul would have made them. The main point is that believing Gentiles should not boast against unbelieving Jews in verse 18. Going on, there was a mystery in Paul's time that still persists in our modern day, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel, but when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, all Israel will be saved. Verse 25. For I don't desire you to be ignorant, brothers, of this mystery, so that you won't be wise in your own conceits, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved, even as it is written, there will come out of Zion the deliverer, and he'll turn away ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I will take away their sins. Concerning the good news, they're enemies for your sake, but concerning the election, they're beloved for the Father's sake. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For as you in time past were disobedient to God, but now have obtained mercy by their disobedience, even so these also have now been disobedient, that by the mercy shown to you they may also obtain mercy. For God has shut up all to disobedience, that he might have mercy on all. O the depth of the riches both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past tracing out. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has first given to him, and it will be repaid to him again? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. Comment in verses 25 to 36, all Israel will be saved when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. God started a work in Israel and will complete it. Israel are the elect of God, and God will not unelect them, because the gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. God will bring Israel's salvation to pass in his own wise way. Paul knows God will save Israel because the Old Testament says so in his reading of it. In verse 25, Paul called Israel's salvation a mystery, probably meaning it was a mystery not just to his audience, but also to himself, in a concession that his knowledge of the subject was partial. This much he knows, all Israel will be saved when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, and to back himself up on it, he cites Isaiah 59 verses 20 and 21, and Isaiah 27 verse 9. Quoting them straight from Isaiah, the first one reads, A Redeemer will come to Zion, and to those who turn from disobedience in Jacob, says Yahweh. As for me, this is my covenant with them, says Yahweh. My Spirit who is on you, and my words which I have put in your mouth, shall not depart out of your mouth, nor out of the mouth of your offspring, nor out of the mouth of your offspring's offspring, says Yahweh, from henceforth and forever, end quote. And the second one is, the iniquity of Jacob will be forgiven, end quote. Jacob's another name for Israel. The iniquity of Israel will be forgiven. But the citation Paul gives, these two citations, in terms of Israel being saved, are only a couple of examples, a small sample of what he could have quoted. And it's not that every Israelite of the flesh at every point in history will be saved. That certainly will not be the case, as Paul has already said about his own generation, that in general they haven't responded to the gospel. And again, in this passage we just read, he said Israel is partially hardened. So no, not all Israelites in history will be saved, but all Israel will be saved when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. So what does fullness of the Gentiles mean? Paul recognizes he lives in an age of Gentile responsiveness and Jewish resistance, but at some point there'll come an age which is characterized by Jewish responsiveness, and that age won't come until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Does that mean when every last Gentile who will be saved has been saved? Or does it mean there'll be a reversal of trends, that right now mostly Gentiles are being saved, but there'll come a time when mostly Jews are being saved? These are open questions we can't answer. But that term, fullness of the Gentiles, might refer to something else. Jesus said, quote, Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Luke 21:24. That would refer to Gentile invasions of Jerusalem or Gentile control of Jerusalem or partial control or interference into Jerusalem's affairs until the Gentiles' appointed times for doing so are fulfilled. And this would take us right up to the last day until Jesus' return, because we know the government of the Antichrist will trample on Jerusalem during the tribulation, Mark 13:14, right up to the day Jesus returns to defeat the Antichrist and set all things right. So in review, the fullness of the Gentiles could mean the full number of Gentiles who will be saved. That's the most likely thing to your narrator. It fits the context of this passage best. Or it could mean the fullness of the times appointed for the Gentiles to trample Jerusalem. But it seems to your narrator not to matter, because both scenarios take us right up to the last day, because surely a few Gentiles will be saved right up to the last day when Jesus returns, and surely the Antichrist government will trample Jerusalem right up to the same day. And of course, on that day, the day Jesus returns, he'll set up his kingdom, Matthew 25:31. And we know that during the kingdom age, all Israel will be saved. They'll know Yahweh from the least to the greatest, Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. So whether the fullness of the Gentiles is the full number to be saved or their full time to trample Jerusalem, both scenarios take us to the same day, it seems to your narrator, which is the day of Jesus' return. Paul's main reason for bringing it up, Israel's complete salvation, is to add one more reason why believing Gentiles should not be conceited toward Israel in verse 25, thinking falsely that God has rejected Israel. He has not. Gentiles should respect that Israel is a work in progress and not give any offense to unbelieving Israel so as to impede that progress. God would take great offense to anyone who impedes his progress with the unbelieving genetic race of Israel. In verses 32 to 36, despite Paul's intense desire for his fellow Jews to be saved, he's more than happy to commit the matter to God in view of God's mercy in verse 32, the depth and riches of his wisdom and knowledge in verse 33, his judgments and untraceable ways in verse 33, his mind that no one knows in verse 34, his lack of need for any counselors in verse 34, his indebtedness to no one in verse 35, and his ownership of all things in verse 36. To this awesome God be the glory forever, he says. Amen. Romans 12 is next.